许先生和 Maurice Strong 先生今天在这里呢，我们采访呢主要是为了今后编一本书。
Well, in the 1960s, it became increasingly evident that the industrial development, particularly in the more developed countries, was beginning to have some side effects which were very negative. The waters became polluted. The air became contaminated. The plant and animal life was being affected, and human health conditions were clearly being affected. And so the country of Sweden was very sensitive to these issues, and they proposed in 1969 in the United Nations General Assembly that these problems deserve to be given world attention and to be put on the agenda of the United Nations. And for this purpose, they proposed to convene a world conference. And there was some resistance to that by developing countries and even Japan. For example, the Japanese delegate in the United Nations, he got up and he said, well, this problem may be a problem for some people, for some countries, but it's not for us. We don't have such problems. And they were against the idea. Some other developing countries said, well, this problem of pollution, that is a problem for the rich, not for the poor. And we must not allow our attention to be diverted away from our main problem, which is development. So it was quite controversial. But in the final analysis, General Assembly decided to hold the first world conference on what they called human environment, and that to hold it in Stockholm, Sweden, because the Swedish government, which had taken the initiative, also offered to host the conference. So that is how it got started. I recall that this was the first world conference that China participated in after China took its rightful place in the United Nations, because for some years it was the nationalist government of Taiwan that occupied the seat of China. Then when China became, as it should, it occupied its rightful place in the United Nations, this was the first big global conference that China actually attended. And therefore it was a very important event for the United Nations as well as for China. Well, actually, when I was a small boy, growing up in a little village in Canada, in Manitoba, in the center of Canada, in an agricultural area, my family was very poor. And it was a time of big depression in our Western countries. And I could see the injustice in our system, that we have a country with many resources, and yet people were poor. They could not find work. And my father could not find work. And so I became very interested. What's wrong with society that people want to work and they cannot find work? So I became, at a very young age, want to give my life to helping make a better society. But my family is very poor. I could not afford to go to university. My mother taught me, and my school principal taught me. And then I used to go out in nature, and I got fascinated with nature, how in the animals change their skin, their fur, how the rabbits, for example, they are white in the summer and they become brown. They're brown in the summer and they become white in the winter. And how the cycles of nature, I became very fascinated. And so it was not called environment at that time. It's just because I learned to love nature. So as I grew up, I had these two things in my life. How to make a better society that was more equitable, more just, more opportunity for poor people. And at the same time, how our relationship with nature. Then when I was very young, I took a job way up in the far north where the Eskimo people, the Inuit people live. And at that time, they still lived traditional life with snow houses. in a very harsh climate. And I learn a lot from them, how these people lived for many, many centuries in a very harsh climate. And yet they had a decent culture, a good way of life. And so I learn a lot from them about how to live with nature. And then I became interested in the rocks, because up in the Arctic, there were a lot of rocks, mainly rocks. So I got to study this, to find some minerals. And then I went back to our capital city, to Toronto, which is our big capital for mining business. And I got active in trying to develop minerals in the north. And then I began to realize that when we develop minerals, we also hurt the earth. And so I went into this business, first in mining, then in oil and gas, and I did quite well, but at the same time, I realized this is not exactly what I want to do, because in developing our minerals, in developing our oil and gas, I could see that we were also hurting the earth, and we were providing jobs, but sometimes we were hurting the culture of the local people. So this was a kind of a progressive thing, an evolution. Finally, I decided I want to really spend my life doing this. So I give up my job. And I took 2 years to travel around the world. And that's when I first came to China, 1953. And because I had a very distant relative who used to write letters about life in China and about conditions in China, Anna Louisa Strong. And I was very inspired by her life and by her work. So I came to China right during very difficult period. And I was very fascinated by China. So this is how I went back to my own country, Canada. I want to join Foreign Aid Department. I want to help the developing countries. But my education was not sufficient. So I had to decide, what do I do? I want to help. I cannot, but they will not allow me to, because I don't have sufficient education. So I made a big decision. I said, I don't really want to be a businessman, but business is the only place where I can get a job. And business is power in our society. Maybe I should go into business and try to use business as a platform to fulfill my interests in it. And at the same time, I read about the United Nations. And I said, that is what I really want to do. If I cannot join my own government, I join the United Nations. So at a very young age, I got a job, very junior job in the United Nations. So my interest in the United Nations also start at a very early period in my life. So after that, my life unfold through United Nations, and then later on, the Prime Minister of Canada asked me to come in and head Foreign Aid Program as Deputy Minister, Foreign Affairs. And I told him, I said, but very short time ago, I apply for a small job in the Foreign Aid, and they will not even take application from me because I didn't have enough education. And he said, we were very lucky, because if you did have the education, under our system, you could only be in middle level of the department under our system. And I could not do what I am now doing, is ask you to head it. So this was Prime Minister Pearson. So I could not get in at the bottom, so he put me in charge of the whole. So that is how I became a deputy minister and became active in development in what we call CIDA, Canadian International Development Agency. I started that. And then I brought in my interest in environment, because I saw development and environment go together, because it is through development that you affect the environment. So I tried to bring the concept of environment and the concept of development together. And that's why they then asked me, Utant, who was Secretary General of the United Nations, asked me to come in to the United Nations as Undersecretary General with responsibility for environment and specific responsibility to help organize Stockholm Conference. So that is a rather short history of how I got there.